Hello everybody, and welcome to the show. This is my first episode, so if you're here from the beginning, I just want to say thanks for listening. Now, I really dug deep for this first episode. I wanted it to be something special. I hope you get a lot out of it. We have a lot to go through. We're going to be going through the story of Peter Pan in Neverland, all the way through the time of Christ himself. And we're going to also be exploring the words of philosophers and thinkers from across the ages. So, without further ado, here's the question. Why don't we know what we want? The reason I think this is interesting and highly important is because it's likely that many of us have fooled ourselves into thinking that we know the answer. In this episode, I am going to posit the idea that we probably don't know what we want, and if we do, then we may not understand why. Two caveats before we begin. First off, it would be foolish to reduce all of life's problems into a single root cause. I think it's safe to say that if anyone tells you that one thing is the key to success, well, they're probably selling something. But we don't do ourselves any favors by ignoring the impossible task of life, so we do our best. We pick out the things that are important and make it worth living. So secondly, I am going to be exploring some religious and metaphysical ideas, most of which are very old and built into our Western societal culture. It's not my intent to directly argue for the truth or falsehood of any idea, but I'm not going to refrain from using them because they are very effective. Now, let's begin. And firstly, I think it would be helpful just to shotgun out some examples of what it feels like when we're lost. I'd say it's that feeling, that guilty knot in our stomach when we have just spent the day working towards a degree or a job that we don't really believe in, and we know there is something we could do, something extra that would make it better, but instead we watch one more episode of that show on Netflix. After all, what can we really fix in 45 minutes anyway? It's also the creeping anxiety that comes up every time we have to think about what we're going to do after graduating college. It's also that little twinge of jealousy when we pass a happy couple holding hands as they walk, knowing that we've been single for a really long time and don't really understand why. It's also the same reason why opening Instagram is an addiction and anxiety-ridden experience. There's not always an apparent reason why our lives feel so much less exciting than the people we follow. It's feeling trapped in a world where everyone else is free. Our first piece to explore in searching for an answer is a passage from Alan Watts. He's a British writer who bridged the gap between Western and Eastern philosophy in the mid-20th century. The audio quality is a bit old, so it's not great, but here's a short clip from one of his many lectures.
I don't know what I want. Well, when you don't know what you want, you've reached the state of desirelessness. When you really don't know. But you see, there's a beginning stage of not knowing, and there's an ending stage of not knowing. In the beginning stage, you don't know what you want because you haven't thought about it, or you've only thought superficially. And then when somebody forces you to think about it and go through and say, yeah, I think I'd like this, I think I'd like that, I think I'd like the other, there's the middle stage. Then you get beyond that. Say, is that what I really want? In the end you say, no, I don't think that's it. I might be satisfied with it for a while, and I wouldn't turn my nose up at it, but it's not really what I want. Why don't you really know what you want? Two reasons that you don't really know what you want. Number one, you have it. Number two, you don't know yourself, because you never can.
Now, I love the way he arranges his ideas. You didn't get too much context from this little snippet, but that's all we need to begin our own discussion. I'll say just one thing about his first point, because I believe the second is actually more pertinent to most of us. If you think you know what you want, this is going to be the reason you're wrong. And it all stems from the difference between your conscious desire and your actions. When someone asks you about your goals, you can probably spew something at them. Like when you were younger and at every Thanksgiving dinner, Aunt Janice asked you what you want to be when you grow up. And you fed her some bullshit line out of the school counselor's playbook about something about attending college and building a career around this one thing that you're really passionate about. Except that you have no idea and sometimes won't even admit that to yourself, which sparks anxiety and prompts you to never think about the whole mess unless it's absolutely necessary. Of course, that's something of an extreme example, but I'm sure it's a pretty common one. The idea is scalable though. How many people say they want to get in better shape, they make the New Year's resolutions, and constantly worry about the extra pounds they're carrying, but they'll never commit to a healthy lifestyle? Now, I'm not going to talk about the numerous excuses in this example, one or two of which, of course, would be valid, it has to be said, but here we see the difference, the obvious difference between what we say and what we do. Someone like that only wants their health bad enough to complain about it. If they truly wanted to be healthy, they would make the higher sacrifices to get it. They'd watch less TV after they get home from work so they can work out and do meal prep. Or they'd go to bed earlier so they can hit the gym in the morning. Heavier sacrifices would include changing your career to one that lets you be healthy, because obviously if you're commuting 4 hours a day and have kids, it's difficult to make time for the gym. Sometimes it's literally impossible. But what would you do? You would exchange your shitty job or your living place, maybe move closer to work, something to make it better so that your life actually gives you enough time to be healthy. That's what actually wanting something means, not just mouthing the words. You sacrifice for it. You act in accordance with your speech. And it's not obvious to me that most of us have aligned what we say and what we do. So when Alan Watts tells us that we have what we want, he means it. By de facto, if you really wanted something different than what you have, you would change the way you act, which is, of course, most often not the case. But why don't we actively pursue the things that we know would be good for us? That's an old question, essentially a question formed from Alan's second statement: you don't know yourself. I'm not sure I'm capable of completely unpacking it yet. I really do think this is a complex question, but I think here's some of my top ideas anyway. At a very widespread, cultural, eagle-eye view, I'd say it's a cultural shift. Let me add just a little preface from the teachings of renowned 20th century analytical psychologist Carl Jung. He developed the idea of psychological archetypes, basically blueprints that humanity has compiled over the millennia to represent certain psyches. There's not a list of them, but you would recognize the archetype of the hero or the fool, which is the guy who is comedic relief in modern TV shows, or in the Middle Ages that would have been the court jester, that sort of thing. Over a very long time, we've simply agreed on what a hero looks like. And while it's not like there's a set of requirements, everyone intrinsically knows that Batman is the hero. The Joker is the adversary. Now, Western society has been shaped by Christian ideas since the early 1st centuries AD. And since then, believers have upheld that Christ is the ideal man, a physical example of the ultimate hero. But I think the last century or so has seen a shift away from this traditional view. Here's another quote, actually, from Alan Watts, and I believe he was even paraphrasing more of Jung's work from this. I'll read it because I think it'll be easier for you to understand than listening. Quote, "Modern man has heard enough about guilt and sin. He is sorely beset by his own bad conscience and wants rather to know how he is to reconcile himself with his own nature. How he is to love the enemy in his own heart and call the wolf his brother. The modern man does not want to know in what way he can imitate Christ, but in what way he can live his own individual life, however meager and uninteresting it may be. I'm not saying this switch is inherently a good or bad thing. What I am saying is that we may be taking a step back in time if each person has to define the ultimate life for themselves. As Galileo noted, when we add complexity, we also expose the system to a higher likelihood of failure. It just becomes easier to make a mistake. And I think that potential is really what excites us about the future, but it's also the source of our anxiety, because we have the option to keep the future vague, to not define it, so that we don't have a criterion for failure. If failure isn't measurable, then it's easier to fool ourselves into thinking that maybe we're doing all right when you don't have to compare yourself to something. Here's something to give you some scope as to the global effect of this phenomenon. Another influential thinker of the 1900s was very vocal about this intellectual shift. Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher actually, literally titled his 1884 statement, "God is dead." He decried the loss of moral frameworks that had nearly lasted 2,000 years, and let's not forget that 2 world wars shortly followed. That is what at stake. Not just one person feeling lost among many, it's truly a global problem. And we may not be talking about directly causal relationships here, but in the words of Sherlock Holmes, what do we say about coincidence? The universe is rarely so lazy. Before I unfold my second point, remember that we're still exploring Alan Watts' second statement from the opening of this session. To summarize, why don't you know what you want? 2 reasons. You have it. Or you don't know yourself. So here's my second idea about not knowing yourself. Each of us individually struggles with defining who we are and what we aspire to be. Goal setting really is the push button word of the day. That's what everyone uses to describe it. When someone has a laser sharp focus on their vision for the future, they are the people who become highly influential individuals. People like Elon Musk, Gary Vaynerchuk, or Michael Jordan even. What if we don't possess that vision for ourselves? I'd say that's the Peter Pan principle. Now, what I'm about to outline comes from the lectures of Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's a Canadian practical psychologist and professor at the University of Toronto. If you think about Peter Pan's story in terms of its psychological meaning, he is the boy who refused to take responsibility for his own future. He refused to accept his own mortality, and instead of embracing the path of the hero, he hid in Neverland to become king of the Lost Boys. Well, why did he do that? Because his only example for what growing up looks like is Captain Hook. And who the hell really wants to become Captain Hook? He's a tyrant that is constantly chased by a crocodile with a clock in its stomach. And that represents time, by the way. Time is coming for you, and eventually, it's gonna eat you. That's the lesson from it. Peter also meets Wendy, but he can't convince her to stay with him in Neverland. So he basically just forgoes the chance to develop a relationship with a woman, as a result of his nihilism. Pan really thinks that life must be meaningless. He doesn't understand how to live properly, so instead he lives in fear. And we know from Christopher Nolan's rendition of the Batman story, you always fear what you don't understand. That includes yourself. I hope the pieces of the puzzle are starting to come together for you here. Now, we can all relate to Peter Pan at some point in our lives because, especially given modern circumstances, we increasingly face the paradox of choice. Too many options, really. Just not all of them good, by the way, but it makes it painful to choose nonetheless. But if you don't choose what to pursue in life, it's not the case that you simply stay neutral where you are. As the philanthropist Tony Robbins states, one of the 6 essential human needs is growth. If we're not growing, then we begin to die inside. We torment ourselves for not pursuing the highest meaning possible in our lives. We disappoint ourselves and the people who love us. So the natural question to follow is, what can we do about that? What is the best way to ensure continued growth and avoid turning into Peter Pan, the nihilistic boy that rejects the path of the hero? One answer, I think, is to learn how to think properly. If you can think, maybe you can begin to tackle the problem of understanding yourself, the meaning of your past, who you are now, and the really big problem of defining the person you aspire to become. That's what the university, I think, really were supposed to teach you. At least in the beginning, they'd say, with all thy getting, get understanding. Unfortunately, I also think that the university format has generally degenerated. First really into a workforce training ground, and now in many cases it's little more than debt-laden pleasure island. And I'm literally saying that from the library study room that I use for a studio. So it's a little messed up. Here, we're building really to the climax of the episode, which I think ought to be the part where we put together some answers. Even if we can't answer the original question, maybe we can decide what to do about it. I want to insert here a clip from Dr. Jordan Peterson's psychology lectures that essentially outlines the importance of understanding life's priorities, and it really gives us direction in how to actually go about designing our future. While you listen, keep in mind my earlier example of fitness, especially with regards to the idea of making sacrifices for what you want. Also remember that he's talking about defining your goals, essentially giving us a framework for how to decide what's important in the absence of a collective metaphysical hero. It's all in understanding how you choose what to focus on and what you do about it.
The next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, and this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. We talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro-routine analysis. So if I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved in all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, you know. So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you know, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. You know, and you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. And so that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is to plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss. And both of those work, you know, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. But you know, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. So, you know, they're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring, and it's such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. And I think we did an economic calculation about that a while back, right? Your time's probably worth $50 an hour, something like that. I mean, you're not getting paid that now, but you're young. And so this is investment time. And what you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So let's say it's $50 an hour, which is perfectly reasonable. So if you waste 6 hours a day, and you are, then you're wasting about $2,000 a week, or about $100,000 a year. So like, go ahead, but that's what it's costing you every hour. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. So let's say it's not $50, it's 30, whatever. Maybe it's 100, it's somewhere in that range. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, what if I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. And so that seems like a stupid solution.
So, what's one of the biggest ideas we just learned from him? I'd say it's write it down. Now that's cheesy as hell to say, I get it, but there's no difference between writing and thinking. Writing brings those thoughts into physical being. It puts them in a format that is malleable so that you can reshape ideas that didn't come out fully formed, and you can share them with other people. Write down your goals so that you can visualize and understand them. You can understand what they mean and keep writing to discover what sacrifices they will demand of you. A few thousand years of thinkers actually tell us that we will never get it right the first time when you are picking your goal. So choose something, whatever it is, to be your guiding star that you might avoid becoming king of the Lost Boys. Write down your fears. There's probably a lot of them because we always fear what we don't understand. Take responsibility for your past, present, and future. The path of the hero demands constant growth, because it ain't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. Thanks for listening.